Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing?
How's it, Nick? How's it, Hermann?
And we are also joined, of course, by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you? How is the fair capital?
It's a nice day in Pretoria. I must say, it's a beautiful little day. It's my type of weather, not too hot, not too cold. Bit of sun, but not too much, because I don't know if people at home can see the skin. If I were any whiter, the KKK would endorse me.
Right. So, speaking of elections and endorsements, our first topic for today is a series of by-elections that were held across the country yesterday. So we've been having quite a few of these recently, and they give us not a super accurate gauge of the temperature of the electoral system in South Africa, but at least a sort of general idea of how things are going. And following on the trend from the last set of by-elections we had, it looks like the ANC is continuing to struggle in a lot of places. So there were two important elections. I think there were 4 by-elections yesterday. The ANC retained 2 seats, although with about 5% drop in their vote. But there was a very hotly contested ward seat in Tshwane, Ward 96, and there was another very hotly contested seat, Ward 55, in the Mahikeng municipality in Northwest, where the EFF managed to win the seat and throw the ANC out. So, interesting stuff. Which one do we want to start with? Marius, let's start maybe with the Northwest seat. What do you make of this one? It looks like it's another kind of blow for the ANC outside of its sort of, traditionally the ANC has had these provinces where it's strongest, places like the Eastern Cape, places like rural and Mpumalanga. And it seems to be kind of holding the line there. But all over the other places in the country where the ANC is a little bit weaker, it seems to be kind of be cracking. And Northwest is one of those places where it seems to be losing ground to the EFF. Do you think we can draw that conclusion from this by-election?
Yeah, I think so. I wonder if there's also an ethnic element to it, because last month there was also a by-election in Polokwane in the Northern Cape, where the EFF also won a seat of the ANC.
That municipality is just on the border with Northwest, so it's very similar.
So I wonder if there's a lot of Tswana speakers are maybe getting sick of the ANC and moving on to the EFF. What was interesting about the Polokwane election from last month was that the EFF candidate was a former mayor of Polokwane, and he was an older ANC guy that had moved over. So he had a bit of name recognition. When I Googled the guy who won the election yesterday, Mafeking, I couldn't really find so much about him. There's a couple of mentions of him on the EFF Twitter's page, but, he doesn't seem to be, a long-running politician or an older ANC guy or a well-known guy in the municipality. So I think it's quite telling that the EFF has won a seat there. It's definitely something to keep an eye on. As you say, in some parts of the country, especially the Eastern Cape, the ANC is still getting 80% of the vote, even 90% sometimes. That's the real heartland of the ANC. But in other parts of the country, it's definitely starting to lose support in places where it was also getting 80 or 70% of the vote. So it's definitely something to watch. Also interesting, there was another by-election in Nelson Mandela Bay yesterday, where in the local government election last year, the ANC got 75% of the vote, went down to 65% of the votes, with the EFF getting about 16%. But it was interesting that a movement or party called the Bantu Integrity Movement got about 15% of the votes. And overall, they only got 15 votes in the election last year, but went up to over 200 in the by-election yesterday. So, there's definitely, and we've seen this across the country too, and this was also in the local government elections last year, these small local interest parties are really, they are one of the biggest threats to the ANC, apart from, the EFF, whatever the case is, in municipalities across the country. And also actually in the Western Cape, the DA also lost some support to these small local interest parties. So I think that's definitely something to watch in the future. And just on one last point, if I remember correctly, in 2016, only 10% of people didn't vote for the ANC, EFF, or the DA. In last year's election, that doubled. So 20% of people didn't vote for one of the big 3 parties. So I think there's definitely going to be a trend in South Africa, people supporting these smaller parties.
Yeah, I think this is a very big threat to the ANC in 2024, is the kind of death by 1,000 cuts. as despite some of the reforms to our electoral process, which I think we can get into a little bit later in the show, it's still pretty easy to get into parliament. You need 0.25% of the vote, and the lower the turnout is, and our last local election had very low turnout, and I suspect that our next national election also will have quite low turnout. You see, that you don't actually need that many votes to get into parliament. So I think we're really seeing a potential situation here where, rather than the ANC being felled by one thing, as we've said before, there'll be 1,000 little parties getting one seat all over the place. And that's a very difficult fight to fight, because you have to fight a whole bunch of different campaigns against different enemies, and they can attack you from many directions. But the other interesting by-election that happened yesterday is this by-election in Ward 96 in Tshwane. So it was a DA-held seat. They won it with about 50% of the vote in the 2021 municipal election. And the councillor for the DA who was serving there resigned or retired, and he was replaced. He stood again, but this time for Action SA. And he said that he was going to, now win back the ward again, but this time under the Action SA banner. Just before this, a senior member of the DA in Tshwane, Michael Shackleton, who is a member of the parliamentary legislature, defected to Action SA, and Action SA put an enormous amount of resources into this by-election, as did the DA. I think the national leaders of both parties were campaigning in that province, and people were being called in from all over. I heard from some people on the ground there that the DA was there at 4:30 to set up their tents outside some of the voting stations. Action SA was there even earlier. So an enormous amount of enthusiasm. And by comparison, the EFF, which actually won a voting district in this ward, only showed up at 2:30 in the afternoon to set up their stuff. So clearly they were not super motivated. But the end result of this by-election was that the DA decreased slightly, down to about 45%, so a drop of about 5. Action SA shot up to about 21% of the vote from 8%. And the Freedom Front Plus and the ANC seem to have taken a battering. So I think there's a lot of election analysis to be done here about who voted for whom and what the impact of local candidates and all that stuff kind of was. But it seems a lot to me like, despite the incredible amount of vitriol and aggressiveness between the DA and Action SA in this by-election, Action SA had far more success getting votes from the ANC and EFF kind of supporters, and maybe even from the Freedom Front Plus a little bit, than it was at hurting the DA's majority, which only decreased very slightly. Herman, what do you make of these results?
Yeah, no, I must say, it's sort of a situation where both the DA and Action SA have something to claim a win on. To go from 6% to 21% is significant, and for the DA side, of course, is to retain a ward against your own previous, councillor in the ward, against a vast campaign. I mean, not just the Tshwane Action SA, but Gauteng and South Africa threw a lot of resources at this, and perhaps part of the reason is that the Tshwane coalition really is the coalition currently in the country that is probably most formative for future wild dog coalition, parties except the ANC and the EFF. So both these parties.
It also doesn't include the Patriotic Alliance, which is another kind of not so much a wild dog party, I would say.
Yes, no, I mean, I must say the Patriotic Alliance is as opportunist politically as they come, and to their credit, they are rather open about it. They don't pretend to be ideologically aligned to any faction, left, right, or however you want to slice the ideological cake. So both Action SA and the DA have something to boast about here. Interesting, though, is the Freedom Front Plus, totally overshadowed in terms of advertising, in terms of spending, in terms of campaign resources in a part of Pretoria that usually could still have some Freedom Front Plus electoral assets hidden in it. But the Freedom Front Plus just really nowhere, and this really became a two-horse race with only the DA or Action SA in with a shot. And it's interesting that Action SA seemed to genuinely think that they could win this. Now, going from 6% to 21% is good, but 21% isn't near enough to win a ward. So it does sort of beg the question, what Action SA based this whole thing on. They recruited this member who stood for the DA in that ward previously to Action SA. Then there came this by-election. So one wonders what went into the calculus here, because in terms of throwing your whole machinery at a by-election, thinking you can win it, being there at 3 o'clock in the morning, really boosting your chances in terms of or boosting the expectation with the expectation game, then to fall significantly short of a victory does beg the question of some lack of political judgment on Action SA's side. And the fascinating thing, of course, here is what the tensions arising from this campaign will do to the governing coalition in Tshwane, because it was very much a dirty fight, Action SA especially targeting the DA. Don't vote DA, vote Action SA. So I must say, while this won't be massively significant for the actual politics, the actual governance of the city, it does up the tensions in the governing coalition and also heading into 2024.
I just want to push back a little bit there. I think that Action SA, I don't think they ever thought they're going to win this election. And I think it's important, even if you don't think you're going to win the election, to act as if you are going to and you have a real shot, to show, be involved in the, and come and set up at 4 a.m. or whatever the case is. And, because these by-elections are also partly advertising in a way, just putting your party forward, because there's lots of wards across the country where the ANC will definitely win, the DA will definitely win. Other parties compete, because I think it's a way of marketing yourself as a party. So just wanted to.
No, I must say that there are a few reasons for me to think that Action SA thought they could win this. Number one was their recruiting of the ward councillor in the first place to their party, and thereby creating the by-election. So
we don't know if he left of his own accord, though. We don't know what happened behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, that's always a difficulty. He did lose a chairmanship within the Tshwane Council, and then was quite unhappy with the DA, as all DA defectors seem to be. But I would say that Hermann Mashaba being there, Bongani Baloyi being there, what's the other guy, John Moody being there, these are really the biggest shots that Action SA could call in, and to do that in a seat you don't think you can win, I think is an odd spending of political capital, but I might be wrong.
So I think it is interesting, though, that and I suspect this is one of those things where personality really does come into political politics, party politics. A lot of members of Action SA at senior leadership are former DA people, and let's just say that there's not a lot of love on a personal level lost between the senior leadership of the DA and the senior leadership of Action SA. And I can't help but feel that at least some of the political decision-making by both parties in this case is kind of driven a little bit by this kind of personal animus. But the voters, to me, it seems, don't seem to have paid that much attention, because, like I said, it seems like Freedom Front Plus and ANC voters tended to go for Action SA, which in and of itself is a curious way that the politics is going. So I think that we've got a long road to go, but probably I'm sure Action SA is probably a little bit disappointed by this result. Once again, though, very low turnout election, so drawing firm conclusions about the future of the country, I think, from by-elections can be a little bit tricky, particularly when turnout is so low. But we will, of course, have to see. All right, let's move on to our next topic.
Oh, can I just one thing on the last thing on these by-elections? There's a by-election coming up in Ward 53, I think, in Soweto, at the beginning of June, and Action SA got about 14% of the vote there in the election last year. and the ANC is at about 60%. So I think that's also going to be very interesting to look at the. I mean, that's obviously a ward that's probably just about 100% black. I mean, see how Action SA does there compared to how it did in a ward which is, I think probably 80 or 90% white, whatever the case is. So I think it's definitely one to watch, and it'll be interesting to, just kind of a weather vane to show where our politics is maybe going.
Right.
Nick,
I want to move on to the next topic. Sorry.
A slightly left field remark, though, is in a conversation with Mr. Shackleton, the DEA to Action SA defector, he confirmed to me that Action SA is in favor of race-based policies, and that was an illuminating little discussion I had with him, but perhaps that's something to look at a later stage.
Yeah, no, there's a whole another discussion to be had on that one, which is exactly why I want you to bring it up, because that is an interesting can of worms to talk about. Anyway, okay, let's go on to our next topic, and this is one that Marius really didn't want to talk about. I see Moonchild is shouting at me in the comments for shutting Hermann up. I do apologize. I see that Marius was really bitter about talking about this episode, this topic. I think because it's kind of one of those depressing, boring topics that we talk about all the time. But I feel like this is a little bit maybe perhaps of a vegetable type of topic, in the sense that we just probably have to get through this, because it's good to keep this in mind, and that is the public sector wage bill. I'm sure everyone who listens to the show regularly knows that this is one of the core problems with South Africa's governance. The fact that we spend something like a third of all government expenditure on paying our civil servants, and yet we don't seem to get an enormous amount of payback in terms of services for that money. Well, the public sector wage unions are demanding a 10% pay increase to help them offset inflation, basically, is their concern. They also are only willing to negotiate a single year pay deal. In other words, there could be a strike again next year, or if government doesn't agree to their demands, there'll be a strike this year, and they're saying that there could be a strike again next year, because they no longer trust government to honor long-term accords. And the unions have brought up the fact that in 2020, when the COVID pandemic hit and the economy was going to pieces and the government expenditure was going through the roof, the government reneged on some wage increases that it had promised the civil servants. Currently inflation is about 6%, and the unions are demanding a 10% pay hike. There's also, there's more specifics to that. 2,500 Rand increase in monthly housing stipends, allowance of 12% of workers' basic salary when disasters such as COVID strike, permanent employment for teacher assistants, community workers, and security force reservists. So a whole bunch of stuff there. Marius, because I so viciously slandered you at the beginning here, what do you make of the story? It just seems once again like the unions are not willing to let any of this go without a fight, despite our terrible financial situation. To be fair, it's improved a little bit because we've had better than expected tax returns, but still, we're not in a good place financially.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of want the unions to come to the party in private companies. As much as done as possible to not fire people, and they'll say, guys, sorry, there's no increases this year. This is what's going to happen if we don't want to retrench anybody. And workers will, generally say, yes, that's fine. Everybody works together. But the public sector unions, they do seem to think that the government is basically, this a magic money tree where you can just say, click your fingers and make it possible, and suddenly we can have all this money. And, it's simply not sustainable. Something is going to have to give. We're already. Most government expenditure goes to salaries at the moment. I think 80% of the SAPS budget goes to salaries or something like that. Very little goes to operational stuff and to, keeping equipment maintained and whatever you. As I say, it's simply not sustainable. And I think unions, they're actually quite selfish in a way, and they don't. I don't know. If, obviously, at a very micro level, this is in the best interests of their members. But at a macro level, as I say, something's going to have to give. The people are going to have to get retrenched, or the government's simply going to not be able to spend any more money, or we're going to eventually get to a Sri Lankan situation where we just start printing money, and then we're going to look like Zimbabwe or Venezuela in 5 years' time. And of course, nobody wants that. But yeah, I think there needs to be some kind of unions need to stop being selfish in this issue, and of course they need to protect their workers' best interest. But as I say, I actually don't know if 10% increase for the workers is actually best interest long term and looking at the much bigger picture.
I must say, I think a lot of people in the private sector are going to look at this, a 10% pay hike, and think to themselves, what? Civil servants are already pretty well paid, at least especially compared to the majority of South Africans who are employed, who, don't get an awful lot of money. And, I just think about, most of my friends and family, all in this sort of happily middle class. And I can't think of anyone who's gotten anywhere close to this. In fact, a lot of them have not, as Moonchild in the comments said, have not received raises over the last couple of years because of COVID, or didn't receive above inflation increases, or sometimes receive below inflation increases. It just seems, once again, this is totally out of touch with reality. These are not, for the most part, there are some civil servants who do live quite close to the breadline, but there are a lot who really don't, who are comfortably middle class. And for those guys especially, it seems totally out of whack. Herman, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I think in a way, I don't have much to add to what you and Marius have said in terms of the substance on the feasibility of this. But I do think there's something to be said for this being, just another chicken coming home to roost. Over the last decade, the civil service, especially since the start of the Zuma era, and even a bit before that, the civil service has really become incredibly bloated and sort of an indirect job creator. I remember that during the Zuma presidency, the jobs created in the public sector was bigger than the jobs created in the private sector. And oftentimes when government boasted of jobs being created in the country, many of them would be public sector jobs. So it's been this political football that's sort of been this band-aid to stick over many significant economic policy failures. And when the fiscal pinch really starts hurting, and the state is just incapable of paying off this bloated, inefficient body of workers that it has built up for its own political ends, and that your tax base is shrinking, inflation is eating away at even your tax base's resources, then this is the inevitable end of such an irresponsible growth of the state over the last decade. So it is another chicken coming home to roost, like Eskom, like SAA, like infrastructure, like water. We are probably going to see over the next few years already becoming a problem in some of the metros. So it's really just even the fumes in the engine of the ANC are now becoming short shrift. And to slightly connect this with the previous topic of by-elections and so on, this all contributes to a shrinkage of the ANC's patronage network, which weakens its political power and its hold on the country overall. If you can't even, as a cadre, benefit from a public sector job gotten for you because of your cadre cronyism, loyalties, or whatever, because there's no salary coming forth, as we've seen the ANC even being unable to pay its own staff, it weakens the ability of the ANC to have that dominant political capital. And it is just another reason to think that a post-ANC era is in the offing, and it becomes a question of what comes next.
Indeed. So let's move on to our next topic, which is actually related to this one. This is to do with the Independent Electoral Commission, IEC, which, as Marius said in our pre-show discussion, is actually one of South Africa's most important institutions. If they are legitimate, run elections properly, and don't mess around, our democracy has a much better shot of staying intact and working properly. And if the IEC messes around or seems to be corrupt, well, then we're in for some very big trouble. Well, according to the IEC, they are entering what they call uncharted territory for the 2024 election, which is the next one, for a couple of reasons. One of which is that they say it's going to be difficult and expensive to implement the amendments to the Electoral Act, which maybe Marius could talk about a little bit, which are supposed to be there to allow independents to take part in our national elections more easily. But also that the IEC says that its budget is being cut by many hundreds of millions of rands over the medium term. They say that they are facing a medium-term budget cut of 770 million rand. Morris, my impression at least has been over the last couple of elections, I think I've been at least a little bit involved on the ground in every election since 2009, somewhere around there. And my perception is that particularly the last two elections, the IEC's performance has been markedly worse than at any time before, and that greatly worries me. What do you make of this story?
Yeah, I agree. It's as you said, it's one of the most important institutions. I think since in South Africa, generally opposition parties accept that the results is pretty much the will of the voters. I think in any election where there's 20 million votes getting cast, there's probably going to be discrepancies here and there. And there's a guy, you should follow him on Twitter if you're interested in electoral stuff, a guy called Michael Atkins. He's looked into lots of the stuff and he found quite a few errors in various municipalities in last year's election. But this is probably all just, I don't think there's anything sinister. I think a lot of it's just human error. But this is part of the problem. If there's not enough money for training people and whatever the case is, we're going to start, and not enough, people to double check and triple check and whatever, you're going to start seeing these errors. And we might start seeing where there's nothing sinister behind the scenes, but we start having this human error, and that starts getting people hot under the collar. And that's what you need. In a democracy, the losers, they have to accept the results. And at the moment we have that. Now and again, the EFF will say some silly things that, they're going to take up arms. No, they don't really mean that. We know that. But, who knows about 2024, 2029, when there's real errors happening in elections and the losers don't want to accept the results. We saw what happened in Zimbabwe with that kind of thing. Even though the opposition wasn't the ones who was using violence, it's protesting. We saw what happened from the side of the government. And, we don't have to rehash these to this kind of thing. There's examples from all over the world where the losers don't want to accept the results. And often, and if it's coming from cheating, then we are in big trouble. And I think it's something to worry about. And it's all part of the, the broader problems with the South African economy. There's not enough to pay for everything. And as I said, the IEC is one of the most important institutions in this country. And so that's definitely something that needs to be properly funded. But they can get 10% increases at the IEC, I think. That's all right.
Hermann, as in your role as the managing director, I think, of the Freedom Advocacy Network, you tangled with the IEC a little bit this year, or at least with the consequences of an IEC decision. What are your thoughts on the story?
And it sort of links to what Marius is saying, that the IEC aren't malevolent. I don't think the IEC has gone the direction of many of our state institutions that have become hollowed out by political capture. It's just become hollowed out in terms of basic skills. Because what happened in the court case where the Freedom Advocacy Network drove this case to a successful conclusion was that there was a calculating error that allocated an extra seat to the EFF in a municipality rather than a local activist party. And the IEC really weren't bad at all. They admitted their mistake pretty quickly once FAN got on board. To be fair, there is some criticism to be directed at the IEC for being not really open or collaborative with the small party, and really only became responsive to communications once FAN and our lawyers got involved.
Right, but and quite frankly, it's such a serious mistake that it should never be made in the first place.
Yes. I mean, the allocation of a seat is, it's the whole purpose. They have one job. It is, and that is to determine seat allocation through the accurate counting of casted ballots. But beyond that point, once the IEC admitted their mistake, they were actually quite collaborative. So the danger to the IEC and the integrity of our elections, surprisingly, does not, I think, come from malevolence, but just incompetence. And that's why a lack of resources here in this instance is so troubling, because it's sort of like thinking about South Africa as a bouncy castle. And you want that the ANC is a generator and the wild dogs are a generator that can flood, or at least an engine that can flood this bouncy castle full of air to make it bouncy, where the IEC is really the power socket in which you have to plug the machine in the first place. If democracy goes, then the oversight mechanisms and the battle of ideas can be as heated as possible, but it just doesn't match up too much. So this is worrying. Surprisingly, this is one failure that I would put down to incompetence rather than malevolence, at least for the IEC side. the solution for this, I genuinely don't know. I genuinely don't know. You can't keep throwing money at the problem. You have to cut costs somewhere. But I wonder whether there aren't other places to cut 770 million rand over the next few years. It's a tough call.
Yes, I'm sure every South African who has ever had to interact with Home Affairs can think of a few people. That being said, we did also want to mention that there are some interesting elections going ahead across the UK, particularly in Northern Ireland today, but we don't have time for that. So anyway, this is our last show of the week. We will see you next week. We hope that you enjoyed, found it interesting, and of course, we will see you next week on the Daily Friends Show. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great weekend.